It's a pleasure. Yeah, I suppose it's a pleasure to be here tonight. When Helen asked me, was it in September? She asked me if I could do this lecture, and I said, well, I'm not sure about that. I said, I don't know what the world will look like. You know, that's almost 6 months on, 5 months on. And that's always a tricky one, and it's in particular because she wanted to have a title already, a working title of what I was going to talk about. And how can you tell, especially with a subject that is so demanding and so evolving almost on a daily basis. But yet, here we are. We all I think, are aware of the situation that's happening at the moment. Every day, thousands of people embark on dangerous journeys to find a better life. That's really what they are after, a better life. Some refugees fleeing conflicts, such as Syria, the bulk that we are involved with. Many others are in search of education for their children. We were talking about education. You know, education for their children, that's what most people have in mind. Jobs, better opportunities, freedom, all have aspirations and hopes for a better future. And I would think that we can easily say that Europe is at a crossroads that is both political and humanitarian. So here we have a situation that's different from the one I encountered in September. Now as ADRA, we have a fundraising drive that happens actually next month. It starts, our annual appeal or in-gathering. And as we were planning for this upcoming appeal, we also wanted to focus on people affected by conflict. But we also wanted to wrap that in a wrapper that would be acceptable to people that may not be as knowledgeable about the subject matter at hand. How would people on the doorstep think about refugees if something bad would have happened? We had to plan this in September and October again. So what would people think about refugees in March or April of the following year? And I think with some of the negative press that we've seen in recent months, I think it's good to be prudent in the way we do our fundraising. So if we know everything before we start things, it would be a lot easier, but we all know that that is not the case. And tonight, and you know, been speaking with some people, we know that again, tens of thousands of Syrian refugees are on the border with Turkey, fleeing the fighting in Aleppo. And some scaremongering perhaps. BBC was reporting that up to 600,000 people could flee from the largest city in Syria. They are running for their lives for the safety of Turkey in days to come. Mike mentioned a little bit about ADRA, but I think it's possibly good to explain a little bit about ADRA, because it also demonstrates our position in the church and in the way we actually work in providing relief. ADRA indeed stands for the Adventist Development Relief Agency, and it was established by the church in a long tradition of humanitarian care, of taking responsibility and caring for one's neighbor. Now, the first organization that the church started was called Dorcas, and actually it was a group of women in 1874 that decided that, following the principles of the disciple Dorcas, to actually start distributing clothing and food to the needy in their community. And while this was initially a local perspective, it took a little while, but it eventually became something that was wider and looked at other places. Now, in many places over time, Dorcas, although it still lingers in some areas, it changed the name to what is now known as Adventist Community Services, or ACS. Now, Dorcas still exists, and I can in particular remember the very strong organization of Dorcas that exists in Zimbabwe and Zambia, where you have up to 1 million women active in Dorcas in Zambia alone. A phenomenal drive of community service by the church. So where does ADRA fit in? So if you have Dorcas, if you have ACS, what's up with ADRA? Where does this fit in the church structure? Well, Dorcas or ACS is really about caring for people in the local community. But increasingly the outlook of the church became also to help people overseas, in other areas where the church was working. And it is soon after the end of the Second World War in 1956 that Seventh-day Adventist Welfare Services was established as a department from the General Conference. Note the emphasis on welfare. It is standing in that tradition of Dorcas, of ACS. Now, pretty soon they realized that the name was not really correct, and in 1973 they changed the name to read Seventh-day Adventist World Service, but it was still a department of the General Conference. Now, from here on, my view of how ADRA was established slightly differs from what is in general acknowledged on the international websites. However, I've verified this with many people that were involved in the establishment of ADRA. I've checked it with some of the people at the General Conference, and I believe that this is a true and historic history that I'm going to give you of why and how ADRA was created. So SOURCE was predominantly a US-based organization. It was basically collecting clothing and shoes and some food supplies and shipping it overseas. That was really the essence of what SOURCE was all about. It's not until 1982 that SOURCE was established as a department at our division, at the Northern European Division, as it was named at that time. It already indicates that it really didn't sit too well within the church organization here in Europe. Now, in the 1970s, governments were making available funding for overseas development projects to organizations that had capacity. And you see that in countries like Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands, all of a sudden, there is this ability to tap into government funding to do large-scale development projects overseas. A similar trend is happening in Australia and Canada. So governments become aware of what they call the non-government agencies, or NGOs, non-government organizations, that they actually have a skill set, have a capacity to work in development projects overseas. And so you see schools and clinics, but also large-scale agricultural programs being set up through funding that did not come from the church, but from government agencies across Europe. Now, the Northern European Division realized the potential, and they established in 1978 its own department, and they called it the Northern European Division Development Aid Department. And Audra, a Swede, was in charge of this department, and he has been really the pioneer of what eventually became ADRA. Increasingly, however, the funding demanded also transparency. It demanded a separation of church financial structures and church organizations in order to prove that the money that was given actually went to these projects. So the donors required this assurance of transparency and proper separate accounting of the donated resources. So in the early 80s, what we see in the church, and particularly here in Europe, are two separate humanitarian organizations. We see Adventist Development Aid, focusing on development, and SOURCE, basically working in relief. Audra and some of his close associates thought that this was ridiculous. And so they called for a meeting at Scottsburg Sanatorium in 1984. And in that meeting of the two European divisions, the Northern European Division and what was at that time the Euro-Africa Division, presided over by Walter Scragg, who was the president of the Northern European Division, consulted together and decided to combine SOURCE and Adventist Aid into what then became known as ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. There was representation of the General Conference in that meeting, and it's in the Autumn Council then of 1984 that thanks to this European initiative, ADRA was actually created as a separate agency of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Different from a department or a service or an institution. It's a separate entity. Clear separation of assets and work. So in the following years, then you see the creation of all these ADRA offices around the world. And these offices, because they became independent charities in their own right, were able to access funding from governments and external donors. So ADRA then grew into the organization that we now know. And because of the reach of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it really could expand very quickly. Now, in our case, as ADRA UK, we partner with DFID, the Department for International Development, or UKAID as it is now most often referred to, and the European Commission in attracting funding. And our small office, and we are indeed a small office, we have been able in the last 10 years to channel £26 million of money to help people in need. And I think that's a great accomplishment for this small office. And it's all because we're able to tap into the funds from the external donors. It's not money that comes from the church, it's money that comes from external donors. So, while Dorcas or ACS are an integrated part of the church, ADRA is a separate entity. While Dorcas and ACS are funded by the church, ADRA funds its own activities. And Dorcas or ACS are still part of the church, what we call the church ministries department of the church. I just want you to keep that in mind because it really illustrates also how the funding models may affect how we operate and how we do things as a church and as ADRA. I mentioned before, and I think you mentioned it, Mike, we have 120 offices, more or less. Whether they're all good offices, or whether they are dormant offices, or whether we have offices that really have capacity, we could have another debate on that. But we all follow pretty much the same sort of structure, and we always all follow the same common goals. However, ADRA is more like a franchise model. So we buy the brand name, we buy the mission, the vision, and some of the structural bits and bobs that come with the ADRA brand, but we're very much independent in the way we operate. And that's a strength because it means that each ADRA office builds its own capacity. If you look at Denmark, for instance, they get their funding from Danida. ADRA Germany gets its funding from Aktion Deutschland Hilft, the consortium much like the UK's Disaster Emergency Committee. And again, what I said before, we get our funding from DFID and the EC. So it's very loosely connected. It's a franchise model. We don't necessarily work together, but we have points where we do work together. Where we do work together very well is in emergencies. When a disaster happens anywhere in the world, ADRA International will coordinate the response and will ask various officers, how much money are you going to put on the table for this response? And by putting the money, by pooling the resources together, we actually can have a greater impact in starting to respond to emergencies. Now, we do this because no government agency or UN agency will give any money to an NGO unless they are already active on the ground. If you're doing something, you'll get funding. If you're not there, it's not even worth to ask. So for instance, when the disasters happened in Myanmar quite a number of years ago, ADRA was the preferred funder for DFID. Why? Because we were on the ground. And that's very important for us to realize that if we are active, if we're already doing something, then we can tap into funding. So now back to the subject at hand. I think you have to agree with me that this migrant crisis is of an incredible scale. At the moment, there are more than 60 million people displaced in the world. That's the population of the UK. That's the number of people that the UN says are at this moment internationally displaced people. I'm not talking about IDPs, internal displaced people. These are external displaced people, and that's shocking. At no time in the history of this world have we ever seen anything like that. And how are we going to deal with that? Hundreds of thousands of refugees, and we see it now on our news, actually less on our news these days, but in the last couple of months, were fed up with the situation and started to walk towards Europe, trying to find a solution for their own problems that they could not face in their own countries. 1.2 million in 2015, 1.6 they say for 2016, but it could even be more. Most from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, others from Pakistan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, Morocco, and other African countries. But I think we all agree that the main issue is the Syrian crisis. And I would almost want to say that I believe that this Syrian disaster is of our own political making. It could have been prevented, but it was not a priority for the world's politicians. And I guess we never saw the writing on the wall. And even if we did, we simply ignored it. You know, I wonder what the history texts in 100 years from now will make of our incredible ability to change the world into this unsafe place we witness now in just a couple of decades. How could we change the world in, let's say, 30 years from a safe place into this unsafe world we live in today? And there are a long list of democratic, political, meddling disasters. And then you throw in the mix of jihadists, either under the Boko Haram or the IS banner, and I think you have all the ingredients for this perfect storm we're facing right now. But even when things went wrong, we failed to recognize the signs. 2014, the UN warned and said, look, we're running out of money. We have no more money to help. And if we don't help, the Syrians will not stay where they are. They will go. They will leave the refugee camps. They will start to move to wherever they can. But we didn't listen, did we? It's not only Syria. I heard that last year the World Health Organization had to stop to provide basic health care to 3 million people in a part of Iraq because of lack of funding. 3 million people. No immunizations, no doctors, no health care, no medicine, nothing. So what other option do we give these people but to start walking to look for a better world? I'd wanted to start this lecture tonight with that drone clip that you may have seen of Homs that flies over this utterly destroyed city. And when you see these images, it is absolutely shocking. Now, I worked in the Middle East in the early 90s. And so I remember visiting Beirut just at the end of the Civil War. I remember being shot at and, you know, the desolation of that place. It was nothing compared to what you see, what has happened in Syria these days. So last week, it was an interesting week, wasn't it? On Thursday we had this meeting taking place in London that David Cameron had called for. The UK, Germany, Norway, Kuwait and the UN hosted last Thursday this donor conference in London. The objective was to urge the international community to step up its efforts to help the 13.5 million vulnerable and displaced people in Syria and the millions who have fled abroad. But while indeed billions were raised, and I'm very grateful and thankful for that, at least the money is on the table, the meetings were overshadowed by the earlier collapse of the political dialogue to end this war. And I believe strongly that the refugee crisis will not be resolved unless the Syrian crisis is resolved. And I wish that the two could, you know, go in tandem you know, and accomplish things together. But it looks like possibly we are mopping with the tap still running, unless things are changing. I mentioned before the changing attitude towards migrants in most of Europe. We always like to welcome people to our party. But if the party is no longer ours, but it becomes theirs, we want it to end. So support for the migrant crisis in the UK is down from 36% last year to just over 25% now. Norway is sending back migrants with valid Russian visas. Sweden has started to repatriate economic migrants to safe countries. Germany would like to dissipate refugees across the whole of the European Union, while the UK sticks to its policy of only accepting migrants from the Middle East directly. And Denmark and Switzerland seizing migrant assets. Schengen is under pressure, and countries across Europe are building border fences. On top of that, Europe is planning to outsource the refugee centers to Turkey. And negative news of migrant behavior is also fueling a changing sentiment. So what is ADRA doing? Or what is the church doing? As I mentioned before, ADRA is made up of independent national ADRA offices, each with their own unique opportunities and challenges, but also geographical integrity. Along the current migrants trail across Europe, ADRA's offices in Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia and Slovenia are active in providing some migrant support as they pass through their countries. And this work, mostly supported by volunteers, is difficult and ongoing, from baby carriers to water bottles, from blankets to women hygiene packs. These are some of the things provided by ADRA for the often weary and exhausted migrants. In Croatia, on the border, migrants can charge their mobile phones at 18 ADRA charging stations while they wait to move on. I was quite interested that this meeting was actually taking place a few weeks after another important meeting took place in Zagreb. I was in Zagreb in January 18 and 19, to attend the European Migrant Crisis Summit. And it was attended by church and ADRA leaders from the Trans-European Division and what is now known as the Central European Division. And after 2 days of intense dialogue, we had to come to the realization that we were facing one major obstacle to whatever we wanted to do to help in this migration and refugee crisis. It's the difficulty of finding money to help. We're all driven to do more, but we simply lack the ability to tap into the resources to do so. So ADRA normally attracts governmental funding for its medium-term overseas projects, but funding for responding in this protracted emergency situation facing Europe is more challenging. And some ADRA offices, like ADRA Macedonia, are run by volunteers, while due to internal church, let's say, issues, there is no active ADRA office in Greece. Another complication is that most European ADRA offices are non-operational. That means, in general, they are fundraising offices. We do not have staff that are experienced in running projects on the ground. And so this migrant crisis has thrown some of our ADRA offices in at the deep end in Europe itself. A painful and difficult shift towards an operational model. And can we do it? In speaking with my peers across Europe, caring for migrants when they have been accepted as refugees, you know, as long as people move, they're migrants. Once they have applied for asylum or refugee status, then they're called refugees. So, caring for migrants when they have been accepted as refugees is the sole responsibility of the governments. Allegedly, they do not need our help. However, many countries in Europe are now facing a changing society due to the influx of the conflict-affected people. We don't notice it as much here in the UK. We have migrants coming in, but not from the batch of migrants that have been traveling across Europe. It's affecting countries like Denmark and Germany and Norway and Sweden. I would suggest that the church leadership sees this as an opportunity for our churches to demonstrate a sense of compassion for helping people that are displaced in their communities. So this whole migrant crisis brings a completely new situation to both ADRA and the church, and we have not found a clear consensus how to deal with it. And during this meeting in Zagreb, we all agreed that ADRA should be able to be a better and more resilient organization to respond at the onset of emergencies. And we all agreed that the church should start to be more caring for refugees in their communities. But who will fund it? Let me bring it back to my situation that I can address probably the best. From our perspective, we have a small emergency response fund. 10% of the proceeds of our annual appeal is set aside for responding to medium-scale disasters. It's roughly between 50 and 60,000 pounds per year. And with that, we support between 10 and 15 emergencies through the ADRA International Network. And again, with multiple ADRA officers putting money on the table, we can have some bandwidth. We have enough money to start projects so that we can attract external funding from other donors. So last year we supported the migrant crisis in Lebanon, Macedonia, Croatia and Slovenia with a grant of £20,000. The total budget that was actually put on the table by the ADRA officers was in the region of £230,000. So you can see we almost provided 10% of that funding. Now, our church members in general respond very well to our requests for help during mega disasters. I'll give you some numbers. Remember Haiti? We raised £262,000 from our church members. Remember the Philippines? We raised £166,000 from our members. Remember Ebola? We raised £155,000 from our membership. To date, we've raised £10,000 for our response to the European migrant crisis. It demonstrates that it's proving a very difficult task to raise significant amounts of funding for this ongoing and growing crisis. Now, in the minds of many people, ADRA is, especially church members, ADRA is a big and powerful organization. However, with over 500 INGOs registered in the UK alone, we must realize that we are in reality a small office. While we do have a better reach than many other NGOs, we are still small. Although I believe that we pull above our weight, we have to realize our limitations. At the moment, we have no access to external funding to help meet the migrant crisis in Europe. And it's a situation pretty similar in all the ADRA offices across Europe. Now, on the brighter side, Oxfam UK is providing funding secured from DFID for helping ADRA Serbia right now. I think they provide, well, I'm not going to tell you a number, they provide a decent amount of money. As a large organization, Oxfam has access to these rapid response funds that come indirectly from DFID. We don't. We all see, and I think that's why you're here as well, we all see that there is a need to help. So how do we go about it? Compliments for Newbold, for organizing trips to help provide people in Dunkirk with some assistance. You're not alone. Across Europe, churches are stepping out to help migrants with or without ADRA. And I would say possibly, you know, that there is this way where we see this whole network starting to work, where the migrants are in their home countries, or where they have fled from their home country into neighboring countries. That is ADRA's role. We can help there. When people are migrating across Europe, it has to be a combined effort of church and possibly with ADRA. But as the refugees find shelter and homes in Europe, it becomes the responsibility of the church. Now, I've been asked to also put some critical thinking here in this lecture. So let me give you a few, and maybe we can come back to that later. Reflecting back on the meetings in Zagreb, I think we also have to be cognizant of the tension, not necessarily a negative one, that exists between the church's evangelism as the starting point for providing help to refugees and ADRA's humanitarian principles. ADRA will always defend its humanitarian independent status, compliance with SPHERE, the code of providing relief and assistance to refugees, the humanitarian aid standards and non-proselytizing policies to safeguard our external funding. Well, the church looks at the incoming migrant population as an objective for evangelism. There are some who think that it would be best to integrate Dorcas, ACS and ADRA into one humanitarian agency. But if the church indeed wants to incorporate ADRA back into the church, heralding back to the days of SOS, it needs to define how it will support ADRA institutionally without attracting external funding. Does the church accept that it has to play an active role in caring for the needs in our local community? Do we accept that we have a Christian duty of care for those around us, including the down and outs, the refugees, the homeless? Or do we outsource, travel overseas, or simply ignore to help? Our experience is indeed that it's hard to raise funds for development projects, but easy when disasters strike. I'm also aware of the tension that exists in Adventist theological thinking, where relief work is valued over development. Perhaps we don't want to create a better world here, as we await a better world to come. Now let me tell you where I think we are. ADRA will not stop caring for people in need. We are committed to find ways to help, and we will not stop to explore every avenue open to us. So ADRA is working inside Syria right now. And my team in my office, together with ADRA Syria, is finalizing a consortium application to DFID for a massive multi-year development project inside Syria, focusing on shelter, food, health and education. And the total value is well in excess of £80 million over the next 3 years. We are addressing the problems at root level through this and other projects in the Middle East. So we're working in Syria. And while migrants travel across Europe, we will continue to work with ADRA partner offices engaged in responding. And we will indeed ask our church members to provide funding. And we will also commit a portion of our annual appeal again to help respond in Europe. And politically, through our national NGO platform, BOND, ADRA is calling on the UK government to continue and expand humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees, especially to countries in the Middle East, as well as to countries burdened by this new migration. And most importantly, we think that the UK should lead concerted diplomatic efforts to end the fighting in Syria. And in the UK, we would like to work with our churches to be more receptive to the needs of refugees in their local community, Dorcas and ACS acting, but ADRA perhaps providing the training and the resources. There are many ways to help refugees in the UK through local organizations or by volunteering to help refugees in local refugee resettlement centers. I believe strongly that help should start where we are, in our own community, before we look overseas. And my vision, for the British Union at least, is for the Church to embrace its own migrant heritage and seek to encourage our churches to be safe havens for displaced people. The Church cannot outsource to ADRA its social responsibility to care for people in need in its very own community. And maybe to end on a positive note, during the formative years of ADRA, a lot of funding came from Dutch Interchurch Aid, or ICO. And I heard this story, and I just want to share it with you because I think there is some good information for us in it. There was a Pastor van Leeuwen who was working as a project manager for Africa, for ICO. He was not an Adventist, but he claimed that he always traveled with the Adventist yearbook in his bag. And when they asked him, why do you travel with the 7-day Adventist yearbook in your bag? He said, if ever I get stuck, I can always find an Adventist to help me out. Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice?